So in 2009, I got a call from a number that I didn't even have stored in my phone. It was my uncle, who I didn't really know because he was a self-identified hermit who lived in the desert in Northern California. I had only been to his house once, and I'd only really hung out with him for any length of time when I was a little kid on family vacations in Minnesota. So he called and asked if he could have my address to mail me something that he'd written. And I said, sure, whatever. And then this thing arrived at my house. I had forgotten about the call by the time it did. It was a manila envelope, and inside was a stack of paper about half an inch thick. It had been typed on a typewriter in all capital letters. It was very misspelled. It stunk like cigarettes. It was punctuated mostly with colons, sometimes big rows of colons. So I flipped through this thing thinking to myself, what is this, Uncle Bob? And did not really want to get involved at the time. On its cover, Bob had written that it was a true story about a boy himself coming of age in Berkeley, California in the 1960s and 70s, who was unable to identify with reality and therefore labeled as a psychotic, paranoid schizophrenic for the rest of his life. Bob's life changed irrevocably one day when he was about 16. He was taken to a mental hospital in Berkeley. He was put in a cell. He was injected with he didn't know what, but antipsychotic medications. The cell door was shut and locked, and he was left there. 16. That was the first worst night of his life. But there were others. For the next several years, Bob's life, as he told it in his manuscript, and as I've now told it in my book about him, was tumultuous. He was in that hospital, he was out of that hospital, he was living with his dad, he was living at a school, he was in the hospital again, he was out of the hospital, he was living with his mom. He'd get a job, he was a logger, he was a welder, he'd find some friends, he'd get a girl, and then things would fall apart. At one point, he ended up living down in Louisiana, in Morgan City. He'd gotten a welding job at a tugboat company with a friend of his. They moved down there. And he was doing okay until he wasn't. And he lost that job. And then he would spend his days walking the streets of Morgan City with his guitar strung to his back. And he'd play music for people. And he'd proselytize about Jesus. He'd gotten really into Jesus. And it was going okay until one night, when he heard a scream through the wall. He had a neighbor who he'd grown quite fond of, and she had a husband who was mean and beat her, and so he was pretty sure this was his neighbor screaming. So he went out and he knocked on her door to try to help her, but no one was home. So he went back to his apartment and he fell asleep, and he woke up again to several people in his apartment kicking the shit out of him. So he was being beat up by several people in his apartment. And his roommate, his friend, who he'd moved down to Louisiana with, used to deal drugs. So maybe Bob thought, as he was being beat up by these strangers, this had something to do with his roommate selling drugs. So he fled his apartment in the night. He took a knife in his pants, before he headed out into the night. The guys had said to him if he wasn't out of there by dawn, they'd kill him. And so he took to the streets. And I picture him, my uncle, my young uncle, walking through the dead of the night in Morgan City, Louisiana, with that knife scraping against his skin, trying to find the guys who were going to kill him, knowing he could not go back to the apartment where he lived, knowing he had nowhere good to sleep. When my uncle first sent me his manuscript, I couldn't even type schizophrenia reliably. I had to teach myself, and psychiatry too, had to practice. My qualification to write a book about schizophrenia was I was a hermit's niece. So I tried to learn. I read a WebMD and I went down to the university library and checked out books and tried to understand, what is schizophrenia? What does this mean, this phrase he typed on his book's cover, psychotic, paranoid, schizophrenic? And over time, the more I read, the less I understood. There wasn't some simple explanation I found. Instead, there was a big old fight. A fight between some people who felt that schizophrenia is a real disease, one that will eventually be understood. One day we will figure out what's different inside the brain or the genetic code of someone like my uncle who's been diagnosed with schizophrenia as opposed to someone who hasn't been diagnosed with schizophrenia. But the truth of it is, despite billions of dollars of investigation, they haven't found a genetic correlation for schizophrenia. They haven't found something different in the brain scans of people like my uncle. The question of what this diagnosis refers to biologically remains generously an open one. Now, there are some people, including my uncle, who feel that schizophrenia is, to use his word, a label. Because while schizophrenia isn't necessarily a real illness, it's definitely a real thing socially. A doctor says to a person, "You're schizophrenic." That doctor tells that person, therefore, there's things about you. You're irrevocably sick. You're broken. You're chronic. You're incurable. So over the years, I found myself even more confused about what I should say about my uncle in the scheme of this book, but I found myself less interested in this question of what might be different about his brain as opposed to my brain or yours. I found myself more concerned with this question of Bob walking through the street of Morgan City, Louisiana, in the dead of the night, with a knife in his pants, believing he could not return home, believing he had nowhere to sleep. And I wondered, what are we, the sane, doing about that? Are we providing something for Bob, for someone who might end up in a position like that? And scientifically speaking, there's not a lot that separates me or you from him. There's nothing that says that you or I couldn't become psychotic tomorrow. So what are we providing for someone like my uncle as he's walking through the streets of Morgan City in the night? And I recently was talking to a friend who works at a think tank that is studying homelessness. Lately, people ask me a lot about homelessness because there is a correlation between diagnosis of severe mental illness and homelessness. You've probably noticed this. There's a disproportionate number of people who are homeless who have been diagnosed with severe mental illnesses. Similarly, in our society, our rich country, people who are in jail or in prison or are killed by police are disproportionately diagnosed with severe mental illnesses. And so I asked this friend of mine who works for this think tank that studies homelessness, well, people are always asking me about severe mental illness and homeless. What do you have to say about it? And he said, well, here's the trouble. Because while there's been these billions of dollars of investigation into the question of the genetic nature of schizophrenia, for example, science hasn't actually learned a lot about schizophrenia. There are a few things we know. One, sleep. Sleep is really important. Two, trauma. Trauma plays a role in severe mental illness, the development of it. So my friend who works at the think tank said, when it comes to severe mental illness and homeless, it's sort of a chicken and egg problem because darkness falls, the sun sets. If you don't have somewhere safe to go to sleep, homelessness itself is traumatic. So people who are homeless have higher rates of severe mental illness because they're homeless, because homelessness is traumatic and trauma causes severe mental illness and so on. So from a public policy standpoint, does looking at questions like what causes schizophrenia or what pill might cure it, does that help? Maybe what might help is if we have somewhere safe for people to sleep. So my uncle is walking through the streets with that knife in his pants, and he ends up sleeping that night in someone's front yard beneath a camellia bush. And he wakes up with the noon sun, and he hasn't been killed by anybody in the night, but he still believes that his life is being threatened. So he made his way to a gun shop, and he asked if he could use their phone. The guy said sure, and Bob used the phone, and he called the police, and he said that he was at a gun shop and he was going to kill everyone inside it and to send cops. And then he thanked the gun store owner for his phone and went and sat outside on the sidewalk next to the store and waited, and the cops arrived and arrested him because Bob believed that was the safest thing he could do. He was going to be killed, and so he put himself in jail. And then he was transferred to what he called a prison, and what my grandfather said was a psychiatric hospital where he was facing indefinite involuntary commitment. And through an act of lying, my grandfather was able to get his son out of the hospital. He told the staff that he was a pharmaceutical rep, and they let him inside. And then he didn't leave until they let him leave with his son. So, is Bob's story a tragic one? Often people ask me that, or they say his story is a tragic one, and I disagree. His book, when I read it, and the version of his life that I've written in my book, isn't a tragic story at all because he was a lucky person, especially for a person who has been tossed in a psychiatric cell, injected with antipsychotics, and called a schizophrenic starting at age 16. He came from a family that had some money. He had a stepmom who had the good idea to try to find him somewhere in the country where he could live. And so in about 1980, when he was in his mid-20s, she bought him a little house in the desert, and he moved there. And after a tumultuous 10 years, he lived for the rest of his life stably by himself. He took care of himself, he balanced his own checkbook, he took care of his dogs, he watched television, he read the Bible, he smoked cigarettes, he played guitar, and he wrote down on his typewriter the true story of his life, and he mailed it to me. And he lived that way. The thing he wrote the first night that he was in that little house in the desert, somewhere safe to sleep, in other words, was that he was now in paradise. And as I write in my book, and there for the rest of his life he remained. And so that would be my question to you all, to all of us who might consider ourselves sane, if you believe in that kind of thing, is what would you want if you suddenly found yourself unable to identify with reality, or if you found yourself suffering emotionally, psychically? Where would you want to be able to go if you faced a great danger, as Bob felt he did that night? And so that's what I've found myself focusing on more in recent years, is how can we better provide for the chance that we face a very particularly bad night? Thank you.